The Great Hall of the Galactic Council had seen many historic moments over the past 300 years, but none quite like this one. Ambassador Jake Morrison stood at the human delegation table, his weathered hands resting calmly on the polished surface as the alien voices around him grew louder and more aggressive. The 60-year-old diplomat had served humanity's interests in this very chamber for over 2 decades, and his silver hair and lined face told the story of countless sleepless nights spent preventing wars and saving lives. Counselor Vexhai of the Zephyrian Empire rose from his crystalline seat, his blue-scaled features twisted with what humans had learned to recognize as contempt. The 7-foot-tall reptilian being had been pushing for this moment for months, gathering support from other species who had grown comfortable with humanity's constant service, but resentful of their influence. His voice echoed through the chamber with the authority of someone who believed himself superior to the small bipedal mammals who had somehow earned a place among the stars. "The motion is clear," Vexhai announced, his words translated instantly into dozens of languages through the Council's communication system. Humanity has proven itself too aggressive, too unpredictable for full membership in this august body. Their voting privileges are hereby revoked, their territory restricted to 3 systems, and their status reduced to that of observers only. Vote had been closer than Vexhai would have liked, but it passed nonetheless. 26 species voted in favor, 18 against, with 3 abstentions. Many of those who voted against humanity did so reluctantly, but the political pressure had been too great to resist. The Mollusk Confederation, the Avian Republic, the Crystalline Collective, and dozens of other civilizations had been swayed by promises of increased territory and trade rights. Once the humans were removed from positions of influence, Captain Lisa Brooks watched from the observation gallery above, her military uniform crisp despite the tension that filled the air. She had commanded diplomatic escorts for 5 years and had seen firsthand how human negotiators had prevented conflicts that could have consumed entire star systems. The 35-year-old officer clenched her jaw as she watched the aliens below celebrate what they clearly saw as a victory over an inferior species. Dr. Kevin Hayes sat beside Morrison at the delegation table, his medical expertise having saved millions of alien lives during the Rigel plague outbreak just 2 years earlier. The 48-year-old physician had worked around the clock for months, developing treatments that worked across multiple alien biologies. His reward for this service was apparently the loss of his homeworld's political voice in galactic affairs. General Patricia Stone remained stone-faced as her military career was effectively ended by alien politics. The 55-year-old commander had led joint species operations that had kept peace in the Outer Rim for decades. Her tactical brilliance had prevented 3 major wars and countless smaller conflicts. But apparently that meant nothing to beings who saw humans as useful tools rather than equal partners. Representative Alex Turner closed his files with practiced calm, though inside he felt the weight of watching 3 centuries of careful diplomacy crumble in a single afternoon. The 42-year-old economist had negotiated agreements that brought prosperity to dozens of species, often at the expense of human interests. But that generosity was now being repaid with exile and restriction. The chamber fell silent as Morrison slowly gathered his papers. Every eye in the room focused on the human ambassador, expecting the usual diplomatic protests or desperate attempts at negotiation that marked such political defeats. The aliens had grown accustomed to human reasonableness, to their willingness to compromise and find middle ground, even when treated poorly. Morrison stood and walked slowly toward the central podium where speakers traditionally made their final statements. His footsteps echoed in the sudden quiet, and even the most arrogant council members found themselves holding their breath. The human had served as mediator in countless disputes, his calm voice and reasonable manner earning grudging respect even from those who voted against his species. The ambassador reached the podium and looked out over the assembled representatives of 47 different species. His brown eyes took in the crystalline forms of the collective, the flowing tentacles of the mollusk delegates, the proud avian features of the Republic's speakers, and the scaled hides of the Zephyrian Empire. These beings had called humanity their allies for 300 years, had accepted human blood spilled in their defense, human medicine to cure their diseases, human wisdom to solve their disputes. Morrison placed a simple data pad on the council table. The device contained the formal documentation of humanity's withdrawal from all treaties, agreements, and partnerships formed over 3 centuries of galactic cooperation. Every trade deal, every military alliance, every research partnership, every diplomatic accord that had bound humanity to the galactic community was formally dissolved with that single action. The ambassador opened his mouth to speak, and the entire chamber leaned forward to hear what would surely be humanity's final plea for understanding. Instead, Morrison spoke just 4 words that would echo through galactic history and mark the beginning of the end for the civilization these beings had built together. No words, just exit. The simplicity of the statement hit the chamber like a physical blow. No arguments about justice or fairness, no reminders of humanity's service and sacrifice, no desperate bargaining for a better deal. Just a quiet acknowledgement that the conversation was over and humanity would no longer participate in a system that valued their contributions but not their voices. Morrison turned away from the podium and walked back to his delegation. Hayes, Stone, and Turner fell into step behind him, their movements precise and coordinated despite the emotional weight of the moment. Brooks descended from the gallery to join them, her military bearing unshaken by the political defeat they had just witnessed. The 5 humans walked toward the chamber's exit in perfect formation, their footsteps the only sound in a room filled with hundreds of the galaxy's most powerful beings. No one spoke, no one moved, no one seemed to breathe as the reality of what was happening began to sink in. The humans were not pleading or negotiating or compromising as they always had before. They were simply leaving. Counselor Vex High found his voice first, calling out to the retreating figures with something that might have been uncertainty creeping into his tone. Ambassador Morrison, surely we can discuss the terms of this transition. Arrange for a more gradual withdrawal of services. Morrison paused at the chamber's great doors, but did not turn around. His voice carried clearly through the vast space, calm and final. There are no terms to discuss, Counselor. You have made your decision, and we respect it. We will be gone from all joint operations within 72 hours. The doors closed behind the human delegation with a soft hiss, leaving the Galactic Council alone with the consequences of their choice. In the silence that followed, more than one council member began to wonder if they had just made the greatest mistake in galactic history. The humans had been reliable, predictable, and essential to the functioning of their civilization. Now they were gone, and the vast machinery of galactic cooperation would have to function without the steady hands that had guided it for 3 centuries. Outside the chamber, Morrison and his team walked through corridors they had traveled countless times before, past offices where they had worked late into the night solving other species' problems, past conference rooms where they had hammered out agreements that brought peace and prosperity to worlds they would never see again. Their time as galactic citizens was over, ended not by conquest or catastrophe, but by the simple decision that they deserved better than being treated as useful servants by beings who thought themselves superior. The last light of humanity had been extinguished in the council chambers, and in the growing darkness, the galaxy would soon learn what they had truly lost. Commander Paul Martinez received the recall order while standing on the bridge of the human peacekeeping vessel Unity, watching through the viewscreen as Kitharin and Mollusk warships faced each other across the Andromedus border. The 43-year-old officer had spent the last 6 years in this sector, mediating disputes and preventing the kind of escalation that was building right in front of his eyes. The message from Earth was brief and absolute. All human peacekeeping forces were to withdraw to designated human space within 72 hours. The timing could not have been worse. The Kithaeron Republic and the Mollusk Confederation had been building toward this confrontation for months, their ancient rivalry over mineral rights in the asteroid fields reaching a breaking point that only human intervention had prevented. Martinez had been scheduled to host peace talks the following week, negotiations that might have resolved the dispute without bloodshed. Now those talks would never happen. Lieutenant Sarah Johnson, his communications officer, looked up from her, station with confusion written across her face. The 28-year-old had joined the peacekeeping corps specifically to prevent wars like the one that was about to erupt. "Sir, the Kithaeron commander is requesting an immediate meeting. Their ships are moving into attack formation." Martinez closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of orders he disagreed with, but would follow without question. "Signal both fleets that human peacekeeping forces are withdrawing from the sector effective immediately. Transmit our formal notice of non-involvement and begin preparations for departure." The reaction from the alien fleets was immediate and desperate. Captain Zethkal of the Kithaeron flagship had worked with Martinez for 3 years, developing a grudging respect for human fairness that had kept his people from several costly conflicts. His message was filled with barely controlled panic as he realized the humans were abandoning a situation that could only end in massive casualties. Dr. Rachel Murphy was in the middle of synthesizing a cure for the Rigel plague when her research team received orders to pack up and return to human space. The 39-year-old biochemist had been working 18-hour days for months, coordinating with alien scientists across 14 different species to develop treatments that could work across vastly different biologies. Her laboratory on Rigel Station had become the center of galactic medical research, and her team's work had already saved millions of lives. Sam Collins, her lead researcher, stared at the recall order in disbelief. The 32-year-old had spent 5 years studying alien diseases, building relationships with scientists who had become more than colleagues. "Dr. Murphy, we're 3 weeks away from a breakthrough. The Crystalline Collective is showing promising results with our latest compound, and the Avian Republic just sent new data that could be the missing piece." Murphy looked around her laboratory, taking in the equipment that represented years of collaborative effort and the data screens, showing infection rates across multiple star systems. The plague was mutating faster than they could develop treatments, and without human medical expertise, the death toll would climb exponentially. "Pack everything that belongs to us, Sam. We're going home." Tony Ward, the team's bioengineering specialist, was already receiving frantic messages from his alien counterparts. The 40-year-old had designed the containment systems that were currently the only thing preventing the plague from spreading to dozens of additional worlds. His mollusk colleague Dr. Ilfson was pleading for him to stay, offering everything from research grants to permanent residency to keep human expertise in the fight against the disease. Claire Foster had spent the last 8 years building the economic frameworks that allowed dozens of species to trade fairly and prosperously. The 51-year-old economist had negotiated agreements that brought rare minerals from Zephyrian worlds to species that needed them, arranged for crystalline energy technology to power avian manufacturing centers, and created supply chains that prevented resource wars across multiple sectors. Her office on Trade Station Alpha had become the unofficial center of galactic commerce, and her staff of both human and alien economists had prevented 3 major economic collapses through careful management of interspecies trade relationships. Now she was systematically dismantling everything they had built, sending formal notices of withdrawal from every agreement, every partnership, every joint venture that had made galactic civilization possible. Her assistant, Marcus Wright, a 35-year-old trade specialist, was fielding increasingly desperate calls from alien business leaders who were watching their supply chains collapse in real time. The Avian Republic's entire manufacturing sector depended on crystalline energy cells that were distributed through human-managed trade routes. The Mollusk Confederation's food production relied on fertilizers from 3 different species that only worked together because human economists had figured out the complex exchange rates. Admiral Scott Baker commanded the human defense fleets that had kept pirates and raiders away from the shipping lanes for decades. The 58-year-old veteran had seen his ships prevent countless attacks on alien vessels, his tactical expertise making interstellar commerce possible. The pirates and criminals who operated in the space between civilized worlds had learned to avoid any sector where human warships patrolled. Now Baker was pulling those ships back to defend only human space, leaving vast regions of the galaxy unprotected for the first time in generations. His fleet commanders were reporting increased pirate activity within hours of the withdrawal order, as criminal organizations that had been suppressed for decades suddenly found themselves free to operate without fear of human intervention. Captain Jennifer Hayes commanded the human medical ships that had responded to disasters across the galaxy for over a century. The 45-year-old physician had led relief efforts during plagues, natural disasters, and the aftermath of conflicts that human diplomacy had failed to prevent. Her ships carried medical supplies and equipment designed to work with dozens of different alien biologies, and her crews had saved lives on hundreds of worlds. The recall order meant that alien civilizations would face future disasters without the medical expertise that had become essential to their survival. Hayes was already receiving distress calls from worlds where local medical systems had become dependent on human support. But her orders were clear. All humanitarian operations outside human space were to cease immediately. The Galactic Council held an emergency session as reports poured in from across known space. Human peacekeepers, medical teams, trade negotiators, and military advisors were disappearing from their posts with mechanical precision. The vast network of relationships and agreements that had held galactic civilization together was dissolving. Faster than anyone had thought possible, Councillor Chiron of the Avian Republic stood before the assembled delegates, his feathered crest fluffed with agitation as he read reports from his homeworld. Our medical centers are reporting equipment failures that only human technicians know how to repair. Our trade agreements are being systematically canceled. Our peacekeeping arrangements in the Outer Rim have been terminated. The Crystalline Collective's representative, a being of living crystal named Resonance Prime, vibrated with harmonic distress as it shared similar reports. The energy technology that powered half the galaxy required human-designed safety systems that were now being removed from service. Several power stations had already gone offline, leaving entire worlds without energy. Councillor Vexhai tried to maintain his earlier confidence, but even he was beginning to understand the scope of what was happening. The Zephyrian Empire had built its expansion on the foundation of human-negotiated treaties that prevented conflicts with neighboring species. Those treaties were now void, and ancient enemies were already mobilizing their fleets. The humans had not been dramatic in their departure or vindictive in their withdrawal. They had simply stopped participating in the galaxy that had taken their services for granted while denying them respect. Every human ship, every human diplomat, every human scientist and engineer and medical officer was quietly returning to human space, leaving behind a civilization that was about to discover how much it had depended on the species it had just rejected. Within 48 hours, the first conflicts erupted as species that had relied on human mediation found themselves unable to resolve disputes through diplomacy. The Kitharan Mollusk War began with the destruction of 3 mining stations, and without human peacekeepers to intervene, both sides escalated rapidly toward total war. The galaxy was beginning to understand what it meant to lose the last light of humanity, but it was already too late to prevent the darkness that was spreading across the stars. 6 months after humanity's silent exit from galactic affairs, the first reports of genocide reached New Terra. Dr. Susan Wright sat in her office at the Human Colonial Medical Center, reading intelligence briefings that would have once prompted immediate humanitarian intervention. The 54-year-old former head of the Galactic Disease Control Center watched with clinical detachment as alien civilizations descended into barbarism without human guidance to moderate their conflicts. The Kithaeron mollusk war had consumed 17 star systems, with casualty estimates reaching into the billions. What had started as a dispute over mining rights had escalated into a campaign of mutual extermination as both species sought to eliminate their rivals entirely. The Kithaeron Republic had developed biological weapons specifically designed to target mollusk physiology, while the Mollusk Confederation had responded by poisoning entire Kithaeron worlds with chemical agents that made their atmospheres toxic to reptilian life. Colonel Ben Rogers monitored the conflict from his position at Human Defense Command, his experienced eyes tracking fleet movements and casualty reports with the detachment of a professional soldier who could no longer intervene. The 49-year-old had once commanded joint species military operations that kept such conflicts from spiraling out of control, but now he could only watch as his former allies tore each other apart with increasing savagery. The tactical reports made for grim reading. Neither side showed any interest in negotiation or compromise, concepts that had been foreign to most species before human diplomats had introduced them as alternatives to total war. The Kithaeron fleet had just finished glassing 3 mollusk colony worlds, killing every civilian on planets that had been homes to billions. The mollusk response was already underway, with planet-killer weapons targeting Kithaeron industrial centers. The Rigel plague had mutated beyond recognition without human medical expertise to guide treatment development. Dr. Rachel Murphy reviewed the death toll reports from her laboratory on New Terra, her face grim as she watched preventable deaths climb into the hundreds of millions. The alien scientists who had worked with her team had tried to continue the research, but without human biochemical knowledge, their efforts had been worse than useless. The plague now affected 23 different species across 41 star systems, and the mutation rate was accelerating as alien medical attempts created new strains, faster than natural evolution could have produced them. The Crystalline Collective had lost 3 entire worlds to a variant that attacked their silicon-based biology in ways that carbon-based diseases should not have been able to achieve. The Avian Republic was facing extinction as respiratory variants targeted their unique lung structures. Marcus Wright, now Director of Human Trade Relations, processed reports of economic collapse that would have been unthinkable during the era of galactic cooperation. The 36-year-old economist watched as supply chains that had taken centuries to develop fell apart in a matter of months. The complex web of interdependence that had made galactic civilization prosperous was dissolving into chaos as species found themselves unable to obtain essential resources. The Crystalline Collective was facing energy shortages that threatened to shut down their civilization entirely. Their energy technology required rare minerals that came from Zephorian worlds, but those trade relationships had been mediated by human economists who understood both species' needs and negotiation styles. Without human intermediaries, attempts at direct trade had devolved into accusations of cheating and cultural insults that made cooperation impossible. The Avian Republic's manufacturing centers sat idle because they could no longer obtain the energy cells that powered their production facilities. Their food distribution networks were failing because the transportation systems required maintenance by specialists from 4 different species, arrangements that had only worked because human coordinators had managed the complex scheduling and cultural requirements involved. Captain Lisa Brooks, now promoted to admiral, commanded the human fleets that patrolled the borders of human space. The 36-year-old officer received hundreds of distress calls every day from refugee ships fleeing conflicts that human peacekeepers would once have prevented. Her orders allowed for humanitarian assistance to refugees, but no political or military intervention in the conflicts that created them. The refugee camps on the edges of human space grew larger every week as entire populations fled their homeworlds. The mollusk families who had escaped the biological weapons spoke of watching their children die from diseases designed specifically to target their species. Kitharin survivors described atmospheric poisoning that had turned their sky purple and made breathing painful even for those who survived the initial exposure. Admiral Brooks authorized food, medical care, and temporary shelter for the refugees, but she could not offer them new homes within human space or military protection for their remaining colonies. The humans had learned the hard way that their generosity would be repaid with contempt and political manipulation, so their assistance was strictly limited to immediate humanitarian needs. The Galactic Council had ceased to function as anything more than a forum for mutual accusations and threats. Without human mediators to facilitate communication between species with vastly different cultural backgrounds and communication styles, every meeting devolved into misunderstandings that escalated into insults and eventually into threats of violence. Counselor Vex-High of the Zephyrian Empire found himself leading a coalition of species that blamed each other for the current crisis rather than working together to solve it. The Crystalline Collective accused the Mollusk Confederation of spreading the plague deliberately, while the Avian Republic claimed that Zephyrian military movements were preparation for conquest rather than defense against piracy. The evidence of galactic collapse was overwhelming, but pride prevented most species from admitting that they needed human assistance. 3 separate attempts had been made to contact human leadership, but each message had been deleted without response. The humans had made their position clear. They were done participating in a system that had valued their service while denying them respect. Piracy had exploded across the galaxy as criminal organizations took advantage of the absence of human patrols. The shipping lanes that had once been the safest routes in known space were now hunting grounds for raiders who captured alien vessels and sold their crews into slavery. Several pirate organizations had grown so powerful that they controlled entire star systems, demanding tribute from any merchant ships that wanted safe passage. The psychological impact of the collapse was as devastating as the physical destruction. Species that had known centuries of peace and prosperity were watching their civilizations crumble in real time, and many were reverting to the primitive tribal behaviors that had dominated their cultures before human contact. The Avian Republic had split into dozens of warring factions based on traditional clan structures, while the Crystalline Collective was fracturing along harmonic frequencies that determined social status in their ancient hierarchy. Dr. Kevin Hayes, now head of human colonial medicine, received daily reports of alien medical systems failing as equipment designed with human assistance broke down without proper maintenance. The 49-year-old physician had once worked around the clock to save alien lives, but now he could only document the preventable deaths that resulted from alien arrogance and human absence. The medical reports made for horrifying reading. Entire species were dying from treatable diseases because their medical systems had become dependent on human expertise and technology. The Mollusk Confederation was losing population to genetic disorders that human gene therapy had been controlling. For decades, the Crystalline Collective was suffering from energy imbalances that human engineers had learned to regulate through careful harmonic adjustments. General Patricia Stone reviewed military intelligence reports that showed the galaxy descending into barbarism at an accelerating pace. The 56-year-old had once prevented wars through careful deployment of peacekeeping forces and diplomatic pressure, But now she could only watch as her former allies destroyed each other with weapons. That grew more savage every month. The concept of limited warfare had died with human withdrawal from galactic affairs. Species that had learned to conduct conflicts within humanitarian boundaries were now embracing total war as the only way to ensure their survival. The rules of engagement that had prevented civilian casualties and protected non-combatants were being abandoned as luxuries that only worked when someone was available to enforce them. The galaxy was learning what it meant to exist without the moderating influence of humanity, and the lesson was written in the blood of billions of beings who had never known that their peaceful existence depended on the species their leaders had just rejected. The darkness was spreading faster than anyone had imagined possible, and there was no light left to guide them back to civilization. 2 years had passed since humanity's silent exit from the Galactic Council, and the great station known as Harmony Hub drifted silent and lifeless through space, its corridors filled with vacuum and its halls empty of the diplomatic activity that had once made it the heart of galactic civilization. Admiral Nancy Price reviewed the intelligence reports from her command center on New Terra, her weathered face showing no emotion as she cataloged the complete collapse of the society that had once rejected human participation. The 57-year-old commander had spent 30 years building relationships with alien military officers who are now either dead or leading their species in savage wars against former allies. The tactical networks that had coordinated joint operations across dozens of species had been replaced by surveillance systems designed to detect incoming attacks from neighbors who had been trusted partners just months before. Counselor Vex High stood in the ruins of what had once been the Zephyrian Cultural Exchange Center on Harmony Hub, his blue scales dulled by malnutrition and his once proud bearing reduced to the hunched posture of a survivor. The 7-foot-tall reptilian who had orchestrated humanity's expulsion now commanded only a handful of ships and a fraction of his former territory, most of his empire consumed by wars with species that had once been loyal allies. The irony was not lost on him as he picked through the debris of alien artifacts that had once symbolized peaceful cooperation between diverse civilizations. The humans had built this place as a monument to the possibility of different species working together for mutual benefit, and their absence had turned it into a tomb for those ideals. The Mollusk Crystalline War had entered its final phase with the mutual annihilation of both species' homeworlds. The silicon-based crystalline collective had developed sonic weapons that shattered mollusk shells at the molecular level, while the aquatic mollusks had created crystalline viruses that caused the crystal beings to fracture from within. Neither species would survive their conflict, but their hatred had grown so absolute that extinction was preferable to coexistence. Dr. Rachel Murphy documented the medical catastrophe from her research facility, her former optimism replaced by clinical detachment as she watched preventable plagues consume civilizations that had once thrived under human medical guidance. The 40-year-old physician had devoted her career to saving alien lives, but now she could only record their deaths as a warning for future generations, who might be wise enough to learn from this disaster. The Rigel plague had evolved into 17 distinct variants, each targeting different alien biologies with horrifying efficiency. The mutation rate suggested artificial acceleration as desperate species attempted to weaponize the disease against their enemies without understanding the long-term consequences. Several variants had crossed species barriers in ways that natural evolution could not explain, creating hybrid strains that killed indiscriminately across multiple biologies. The Avian Republic had ceased to exist as a unified entity. Its member worlds either depopulated by disease or controlled by warlords who ruled through terror and violence. The proud flying beings who had once soared between stars as ambassadors of peace were now ground-bound scavengers fighting over the scraps of their former civilization. Marcus Wright, processed the economic data that told the story of galactic collapse in stark numerical terms. The 37-year-old economist had helped build trade networks that connected hundreds of worlds. But those same networks had become vectors for economic contagion that spread financial ruin as quickly as any plague. The collapse of the crystalline energy grid had cascaded through every economy that depended on their technology, creating supply shortages that led to resource wars between species that had traded peacefully for centuries. The Zephyrian Empire's military expansion had consumed resources needed for food production, creating famines that drove desperate populations to raid their neighbors. Captain Jennifer Hayes commanded the medical ships that patrolled the borders of human space, providing emergency care to the endless stream of refugees, while maintaining strict orders not to venture into the war zones where their expertise was desperately needed. The 46-year-old physician watched alien civilizations die from treatable conditions while her fully equipped medical facilities remained tantalizingly out of reach. The refugee camps had become permanent settlements as entire species found themselves without homeworlds to return to. The mollusk families spoke of watching their ocean worlds boil away under crystalline thermal weapons, while Kitharan survivors described the slow poisoning of their atmospheres by chemical agents designed to make their planets uninhabitable for generations. Admiral Price received the first official communication from the remnants of the Galactic Council on a Tuesday morning that felt no different from any other day in humanity's self-imposed isolation. The message bore the seals of 12 species, all that remained of the 47 civilizations that had once formed the galaxy's governing body. The rest had been destroyed, conquered, or had simply withdrawn into isolation as their societies collapsed. The communication was formal and desperate, couched in diplomatic language that could not hide the panic of beings who had finally understood what they had lost. It requested humanity's immediate return to galactic affairs, offering territorial concessions, voting privileges, and economic benefits that should have been freely given centuries ago. Price deleted the message after reading the first paragraph, her expression unchanged as she turned her attention to more pressing matters of human colonial defense. The humans had spoken clearly 2 years ago, and repeating themselves would serve no purpose. The second message came from the avian republics. Surviving leadership, what remained of a government that had once ruled dozens of star systems from their aerial cities. They begged for medical assistance as an engineered virus wiped out their population, offering everything from territorial concessions to permanent military alliance in exchange for human doctors who might be able to develop a cure. That message joined the first in digital deletion, followed by increasingly desperate communications from other species, who were finally learning the difference between respect and desperation. The humans had spent 3 centuries earning alien gratitude through service and sacrifice, but gratitude was not the same as respect, and service without recognition was simply exploitation. Dr. Kevin Hayes reviewed reports of alien medical systems that had regressed to pre-contact levels as the technology and knowledge that depended on human expertise became impossible to maintain. The 49-year-old had trained alien doctors in surgical techniques that were now being forgotten as their mentors died in wars and plagues. The medical infrastructure of half the galaxy was failing simultaneously as equipment designed with human engineering broke down without proper maintenance. Species that had achieved near immortality through human-assisted genetic therapy were watching their populations age and die as treatments stopped working. Civilizations that had eliminated hereditary diseases were seeing those conditions return as their medical knowledge proved insufficient to maintain human-designed cures. Colonel Ben Rogers tracked the military situation with professional interest, noting how quickly professional armies had devolved into savage militias when deprived of human tactical doctrine and strategic guidance. The 50-year-old had trained alien officers in concepts like proportional response, civilian protection, and rules of engagement that were now being abandoned as desperate. Commanders embraced total war. The galaxy had forgotten how to fight. Limited conflicts, and every dispute was escalating into extinction-level warfare. The Kithrin-Mollusk conflict had become a template for other species, who now saw genocide as the only way to ensure their survival in a universe where negotiation and compromise were no longer possible. General Patricia Stone observed the collapse of galactic civilization with the same professional detachment she had once brought to preventing it. The 57-year-old had built peacekeeping forces that maintained stability across hundreds of systems. But those same systems were now consuming themselves in conflicts that grew more barbaric with each passing month. The reports detailed atrocities that would have prompted immediate human intervention in the past, but those interventions had been repaid with political manipulation and eventual rejection. The humans had learned that their sacrifices were appreciated only when convenient, and they were no longer willing to spend their blood and treasure protecting beings who saw them as useful servants rather than respected equals. The galaxy was reaping what it had sown, and the harvest was written in the destruction of everything the humans had helped build. The darkness that had followed humanity's withdrawal was not a temporary setback, but a fundamental collapse of the values and systems that had made galactic civilization possible. The Council's messages continued to arrive with increasing frequency and desperation, but they were met with the same silence that had greeted humanity's departure 2 years earlier. The humans had nothing left to say to beings who had valued their service while despising their presence, and the galaxy would have to face the consequences of that arrogance without further assistance from the species they had rejected. 5 years after humanity's silent departure from galactic affairs, Ambassador Jake Morrison tended his garden on New Terra with the same careful attention he had once given to preventing interstellar wars. The 75-year-old former diplomat found peace in nurturing roses that would never know the complex politics that had consumed his earlier life. Their simple needs for water and sunlight, a welcome contrast to the impossible demands of alien civilizations that had expected miracles, while offering only contempt in return. The morning was quiet until his personal secretary announced visitors at the garden gate. Morrison looked up from his pruning to see a sight that would have been unthinkable during his diplomatic career. The surviving leadership of the Galactic Council walking slowly up the stone path, their various forms of alien physiology showing the unmistakable signs of defeat and desperation. Councillor Vex High led the procession, his once proud Zephyrian features now marked by scars from countless battles and his blue scales dulled by malnutrition. The 7-foot-tall reptilian who had orchestrated humanity's expulsion from galactic society now moved with the careful steps of someone who had learned that survival was more important than pride. Behind him walked the remnants of civilizations that had once thought themselves superior to humanity. The crystalline collective was represented by Resonance Prime, whose crystal structure showed fractures that spoke of barely surviving the wars that had consumed most of his species. The Avian Republic's delegate, Wing Commander Chiron, could barely fly due to injuries that would have been easily treatable with human medical technology. Only 12 species remained from the original 47 that had formed the Galactic Council, and most of those existed only as refugee populations scattered across space. The rest had been destroyed in wars that human diplomacy would have prevented, consumed by plagues that human medicine could have cured, or had simply collapsed under the weight of problems that human expertise had once solved with routine efficiency. Admiral Lisa Brooks stood behind Morrison in her dress uniform, her 41-year-old frame carrying the bearing of someone who had watched civilizations destroy themselves through their own arrogance. Beside her, Dr. Kevin Hayes observed the alien delegation with the clinical eye of a physician who had spent 5 years documenting preventable deaths that numbered in the trillions. The surviving council members approached Morrison's garden bench. with movements that spoke of beings who had been humbled by catastrophe beyond their worst nightmares. Vex High, who had once delivered ultimatums with the confidence of someone who believed his species inherently superior, now knelt in the human garden with his head bowed in the ancient gesture of absolute supplication. Ambassador Morrison, Vex High, spoke, his voice broken by years of witnessing the consequences of his own pride. We were wrong. We removed the heart from our civilization and called it progress. We thought we were eliminating a problem, but we were destroying the foundation that held everything together. The other delegates followed his example, their various forms of alien physiology adapting to postures of submission that their species had not assumed in centuries. Resonance Prime's crystalline structure hummed with harmonics of regret, while Wing Commander Chiron's feathers lay flat against his body in the avian gesture of complete defeat. Morrison continued pruning his roses, his weathered hands steady as he trimmed away dead growth to encourage new blooms. The same patience that had made him an effective diplomat now served him well in gardening, though the stakes were considerably lower and the results far more predictable than anything he had achieved in the council chambers. We offer everything. Vex High continued, his words coming faster as desperation overcame what remained of his dignity. Full voting rights for humanity, territorial expansion beyond your current borders, reparations for the damage our policies have caused, anything. You ask. The galaxy needs humanity. We need you to return and save us from ourselves. Dr. Rachel Murphy emerged from Morrison's house, carrying a tray of refreshments, her 45-year-old face showing no recognition of the aliens who had once worked alongside her in galactic medical facilities. The biochemist who had saved millions of alien lives now served tea to human guests while the representatives of dying civilizations knelt in the garden, like supplicants begging for divine intervention. Morrison finally looked up from his flowers, his brown eyes taking in the assembled aliens who had once dismissed humanity as unworthy of respect. The silence stretched for long minutes as the old ambassador studied the faces of beings who had learned too late that their survival had depended on the species they had rejected. You had our friendship freely given for 3 centuries, Morrison said finally, his voice carrying the same calm authority that had once prevented wars. You had our protection, our medicine, our wisdom, our blood spilled for your causes without hesitation or condition. You threw it away because you thought you knew better, because you believed that gratitude was sufficient payment for service, and that respect was something humans did not deserve. General Patricia Stone joined the group on the garden patio, her 58-year-old bearing unchanged by retirement from active military service. The woman who had once commanded peacekeeping forces across dozens of star systems now managed security for human colonial settlements, a far simpler task than preventing galactic civilization from destroying itself. Morrison stood slowly, his weathered hands still holding pruning shears that represented the simple, honest work that had replaced the complex manipulations of interstellar diplomacy. Now you offer us what we always should have had, but only because you need us. That is not friendship, counselor. That is desperation dressed up in diplomatic language. The alien delegates remained motionless, their various forms of physiology frozen in postures of submission as they absorbed the weight of Morrison's words. They had come expecting negotiation, perhaps some form of punishment or demands for concessions, but they had not anticipated the simple finality of human judgment. Marcus Wright appeared at the garden's edge, his 42-year-old frame carrying reports that detailed the ongoing collapse of galactic trade networks. The economist who had once managed resource distribution for dozens of species now coordinated supply chains for human colonies that thrived in isolation while their former partners descended into barbarism. The galaxy will heal in time, Morrison continued, his words carrying the patient wisdom of someone who had spent decades watching civilizations rise and fall. New civilizations will rise from the ashes of the old, perhaps built by the survivors of your wars or by species that learn from your mistakes. Perhaps they will be wiser than their predecessors, though history suggests that wisdom is a lesson each generation must learn for itself. Captain Jennifer Hayes stood at the garden gate, her medical ship visible in the distance as it prepared for another refugee assistance mission. The 47-year-old physician had spent 5 years providing emergency care to survivors while watching entire species die from treatable conditions. Her expertise available, but unused due to political decisions made by beings who valued pride more than survival. Morrison walked slowly toward his house, then paused to deliver his final judgment on the civilization that had rejected humanity's partnership in favor of humanity's service. His words would be transmitted across what remained of galactic communication networks, carried to refugee camps and dying worlds as the definitive statement of humanity's position. "But it will happen without us," Morrison said, his voice carrying across the garden with the finality of a door closing forever. "We are done cleaning up after those who see us as useful only when convenient, done sacrificing for beings who mistake our generosity for weakness and our patience for subservience." Admiral Nancy Price materialized from the house, her 59-year-old presence carrying reports of increased piracy and warfare in the sectors that human fleets had once protected. The military commander, who had coordinated joint operations across multiple species, now focused entirely on defending human space from the chaos that surrounded it. "You taught us that respect cannot be earned through service alone," Morrison continued, his words cutting through the alien delegates' remaining hopes like a surgeon's scalpel. "You showed us that beings who take partnership for granted will always demand more until nothing remains of the relationship except exploitation. We learned that lesson well, and we will not forget it." The surviving council members remained, frozen in their positions of supplication, understanding finally that their journey to New Terra had been wasted effort. The humans were not negotiating or posturing, or demanding concessions that could be met through political maneuvering. They were simply done with relationships that had been built on human sacrifice and alien convenience. Dr. Susan Wright joined the group, her medical reports showing the continued spread of plagues that human expertise could have contained within weeks. The 55-year-old former Galactic Health Coordinator now managed colonial medical systems that thrived in isolation while alien populations died from diseases that had been eradicated centuries ago.